Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, glad to share another quiet inquiry with you. Tell me, does an old letter ever rest unopened on your desk, its secrets waiting in faded ink? Watson believed that paper remembers what hands try to forget. Do subscribe so no margin goes unread. Now settle in, for as Holmes held, truth lies hidden only until someone troubles to look. Find us too on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel, link below in the description. Chapter 1. The Respected Man of Gray's Inn. It was, as I recall, one of those still and golden weeks of late autumn, when London seems to draw a long breath before the onset of winter, and when the fogs that so often choke our streets have not yet gathered their full strength. I had taken rooms once more in Baker Street, my wife being absent on a visit to her aunt in Camberwell, and I confess that I welcomed the opportunity to resume, however briefly, the irregular but never tedious habits of my old life with Sherlock Holmes. On the particular morning of which I write, Holmes was occupied in an examination of cigarette ash, a subject upon which he had once threatened to compose a monograph, when Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor. "A Mr. Horace Vane, sir. He says the matter is urgent, though he is most particular that no fuss be made of his coming." Holmes raised an eyebrow, set down his lens, and glanced at me with that peculiar brightness which told me he scented something of interest. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson. A solicitor, Watson, and a successful one, unless I am very much mistaken, who wishes his business kept quiet. Let us see what troubles a man who otherwise troubles so many others." I knew the name, as did most of London society that concerned itself with the management of estates and the disposition of fortunes. Horace Vane was a solicitor of Gray's Inn, attached by long service to several of the wealthier families of the capital, and possessed of a reputation for shrewdness that bordered, in the opinion of those less charitable than myself, upon something less admirable. I had met him once at a dinner and had come away with an impression of a man whose courtesy was a kind of armour, beneath which lay a colder calculation than his smile suggested. It was widely whispered, though never proven, that Vane understood the letter of the law with a precision that allowed him to serve it while betraying its spirit. He entered now, a tall man of perhaps 55, dressed with the sober elegance of his profession, his grey hair brushed smooth, his hands, I noticed, restless upon the head of his stick. "Mr. Holmes," said he, seating himself without being asked, a small discourtesy that did not escape my friend's notice. "I have come to you because I am informed that you are a man of discretion as well as ability. I am being threatened, sir, and I wish to know by whom, and to what end." "Pray be precise," said Holmes. "Threats take many forms." "Letters," Vane replied. "Anonymous, of course. 3 in the past fortnight, each warning me that documents are being prepared which will, in the writer's words, ruin me utterly. I am a careful man, Mr. Holmes. I have made no errors that I am aware of, yet the persistence of these warnings unsettles me, and I would have the matter resolved before it becomes a public embarrassment." "You have brought the letters?" Vane produced them, and Holmes examined each with the swift, silent attention I had seen him bestow upon 100 such documents. I observed over his shoulder that the hand was neat, the phrasing oddly formal, as though the writer had weighed every word before committing it to paper. "You have enemies, Mr. Vane?" Holmes asked at length, returning the letters. "Every man in my profession has enemies, sir. I have settled estates, executed wills, advised in matters where one party's gain is necessarily another's disappointment. I do not pretend to universal popularity. And among your recent business, is there any matter of particular delicacy?" Here Vane hesitated, and I saw Holmes mark the hesitation as a hound marks a scent. "I have lately concluded the administration of the estate of the late Sir Malcolm Redfern," he said. "A complex affair, but conducted, I assure you, with complete propriety." "I do not doubt it," said Holmes smoothly, though I caught the faint irony in his tone. "Leave the matter with me, Mr. Vane. I shall make some inquiries." When our visitor had gone, Holmes stood for a long moment at the window, watching the solicitor's brougham depart into the traffic of the street. "A curious client, Watson. He comes to me fearing exposure, yet he will not say of what he is afraid to be exposed. You think him guilty of something?" "I think," said Holmes, settling into his chair and reaching for his pipe, "that a man may accumulate a great many enemies without one of them being a criminal. Vane has spent a lifetime observing the law to the letter while neglecting, I suspect, its spirit. That is not a crime, Watson, but it is a kind of cruelty, practised slowly upon people who cannot easily defend themselves. Such cruelty breeds resentment, and resentment given time breeds strange fruit." In the days that followed, we learned something of those who moved in Vane's orbit. There was Eleanor Redfern, niece to the late baronet, a young woman of evident intelligence who believed with some bitterness that Vane's management of her uncle's estate had quietly diminished her inheritance. There was Arthur Bellamy, Vane's junior clerk, a diligent young man devoted by all accounts to his employer's interests. There was Mrs. Lydia Marsh, who had served as Vane's secretary for above 20 years, a woman of quiet competence and unwavering loyalty. And there was Captain Hugh Fenwick, lately retired from military service, whose family fortunes had been diminished, he believed unjustly, during some legal transaction in which Vane had played a part. Each, when Holmes made his discreet inquiries, proved outwardly cooperative, even cordial. None betrayed the smallest sign of malice. And yet, as Holmes remarked to me that evening, with the fire burning low and the autumn wind rattling the panes, the most dangerous enmities are seldom worn upon the sleeve. We have a respected man, Watson, threatened by an unknown hand. We have 4 persons who might wish him ill, and not one of them looks the part. The letters promise ruin, not violence. Let us see which they intend to deliver. Neither of us, I think, suspected then how soon and how terribly that question would be answered. Chapter 2. A Question of Conscience. The following days were given over to those quiet, patient inquiries which formed so large a part of Holmes's method, and which the public, fed upon sensational accounts of his more dramatic triumphs, so often overlooked. There is little of romance in the examination of old conveyances, in conversations with bank clerks, in the patient tracing of a man's dealings through 20 years of professional life. Yet it was precisely this unglamorous labour that occupied my friend through the better part of a week. We must understand the architecture of the man before we can guess at his enemies, Holmes told me, as we sat one evening surrounded by such notes and cuttings as he had gathered. A solicitor's reputation is built upon 1,000 small transactions, any one of which might conceal an injury done to someone less powerful than himself. What emerged from this labour was a portrait at once consistent and disquieting. In none of his dealings, so far as Holmes could discover, had Horace Vane ever transgressed the law. His contracts were sound, his accounts impeccable, his conduct before the courts beyond reproach, and yet, threaded through this record of legal correctness, ran a darker pattern. Widows whose settlements had been reduced through clauses they had not fully understood, heirs whose expectations had been quietly narrowed by some technical reading of a will, clients who had trusted him and come away poorer, though never with cause to sue. "He's not a criminal, Watson," Holmes observed, knocking out his pipe against the grate. "He is something more difficult to punish. He cultivates legality while neglecting justice, and the law, which concerns itself only with the former, has no quarrel with him." It was the following morning that a fresh development reached us. Vane himself called, somewhat paler than before, and laid upon our table a second note, written in the same careful, deliberate hand as the first. "A letter shall undo what a lifetime has built," it read, and nothing more. "You will observe," said Holmes, turning the paper to the light, "that the writer does not threaten your person, nor even, in plain terms, your liberty. He threatens your reputation, and he does so through the specific instrument of a letter. That is no idle phrase, Mr. Vane. It is a promise, and a peculiar one." "I confess I do not take comfort in the distinction," said Vane stiffly. Nor should you, Holmes replied, though it may yet save your neck if not your standing. May I see your offices? There is more to be learned, I think, from the place where a man works than from anything he chooses to tell me. Vane consented with evident reluctance, and that afternoon found us in his chambers at Gray's Inn, a suite of rooms as orderly as a ship's log. Holmes moved through them with that air of idle curiosity which I had long since learned to recognise as the very opposite of idleness, his eyes passing over shelves of deed boxes, each labelled in a clerk's careful copperplate, over filing cabinets arranged by year and by client, over a desk upon which not a single paper lay out of place. "A methodical man," Holmes remarked half to himself. "I begin to think, Mr. Vane, that your habits of order may prove your salvation, for a man who knows precisely what he possesses will know at once what has been taken or altered." It was in a smaller chamber adjoining the principal office that Holmes paused longest. Here, in a glass-fronted case, Vane kept a small collection of antique legal correspondence, letters and indentures of an earlier century, gathered, he explained, from various estates he had administered over the years. "A harmless indulgence," said Vane, with the first hint of warmth I had yet seen in him. "I have always had an interest in the history of my profession. Some of these documents are above 100 years old." Holmes studied the case with peculiar attention, his head tilted, his lips pressed together in the manner I knew to indicate that some thought had taken root which he was not yet prepared to share. "You keep an inventory of these papers?" "Naturally. Mrs. Marsh maintains it, along with all my other records." "And who has access to this room?" "Myself, Mrs. Marsh, and young Bellamy, upon occasion, when documents must be filed or retrieved. I do not think it a question of much importance, Mr. Holmes. These are curiosities, not instruments of business." "Every object in a careful man's possession is an instrument of something," Holmes said quietly, "though we may not see its purpose until it has already been used." We took our leave shortly after, and as we walked together through the gathering dusk toward the cab stand, I asked Holmes what he had observed that so engaged his interest. "I have observed, Watson, that whoever threatens Mr. Vane understands not only the law, but the human heart that hides behind it. Consider the phrasing of these notes. They do not rage. They do not accuse in plain terms. They promise a reckoning delivered through the very instrument Vane has spent his life manipulating. A document. That is not the threat of a man driven by simple greed or simple anger. It is the threat of someone who has studied Vane as closely as Vane has studied the law, and who intends to defeat him with his own weapons. You believe one of the four we have considered capable of such a scheme?" "I believe," said Holmes, drawing his coat about him against the evening chill, "that capability and inclination are two very different qualities, and that we have as yet established neither with certainty in any of them. We have, however, established something else of value. And what is that? That no crime has yet been committed, Watson. Only a promise of one. Let us hope, though I confess I do not expect it, that the promise remains unfulfilled. In this hope, as the reader has doubtless already surmised, we were to be disappointed, and disappointed within a matter of days. Chapter 3. The Letter Appears. I learned of the scandal, as so many Londoners did that morning, from the pages of the Telegraph, which I had spread upon the breakfast table while Holmes occupied himself with his correspondence. The headline was not large, but its substance was sufficient to drive every thought of toast and marmalade from my mind. "Solicitor's conduct questioned," ran the type. "New document casts doubt upon Red Fern estate settlement." "Holmes," said I, "you had better see this." He took the paper from my hand, read it through without comment, and then read it through a second time, more slowly, his brow drawn into that particular configuration of lines which I had long since learned to associate with genuine astonishment, a rare enough occurrence in my friend's experience. The substance of the article, and of those that followed in the afternoon editions, was this. A letter had been discovered among the papers of the late Sir Malcolm Redfern, a letter purporting to have been written by Horace Vane himself some 3 years previously, in which he acknowledged the existence of a codicil to Sir Malcolm's will, a codicil that would have substantially increased the inheritance of Eleanor Redfern, and which, the letter implied, Vane had deliberately suppressed in the course of administering the estate. If genuine, the document was ruinous. It was not merely evidence of sharp practice, of the cold legal cunning which I had already come to associate with Vane's character. It was evidence of outright fraud, of a solicitor knowingly defrauding his own client's heir, and such a charge, were it proven, would end not only his career but very possibly his liberty. Vane himself denied the letter with what the papers described as vehement indignation, declaring it a forgery of the basest kind and demanding that the matter be placed at once in the hands of the police. Yet denial, however vehement, carried a little weight against the document itself, which the newspapers described in terms that left small room for doubt as to its apparent genuineness. It was not yet noon when Vane arrived at Baker Street, and I confess I had never seen a man's composure so thoroughly stripped away. The courtesy that had marked his earlier visits was gone entirely, replaced by something close to desperation. "You must see it, Mr. Holmes," he said before he had fairly crossed the threshold. "I have brought a photographic copy, the original being now in the hands of my solicitors, though I might as well say my enemies, for not one of them will credit my denial. I never wrote that letter. I swear it before God, I never wrote it." Holmes took the photograph and studied it beneath his lens with the silent, absorbed attention I had seen him bestow upon 100 questioned documents in the course of our long association. I leaned over his shoulder and observed what I could. The hand was unmistakably Vane's own, so far as my untrained eye could judge, sloping and economical, with the particular flourish upon the capital 5 that I recalled from the letters he had brought us some days before. The stationery bore the watermark of a paper merchant in Holborn, whose wares, Holmes informed me afterward, Vane had used for above a decade. The signature matched. The legal terminology employed throughout was precise, technical, entirely consistent with the language Vane himself habitually used, language that no layman surely could have reproduced with such fluency. The date corresponded exactly to a period when, by Vane's own admission, he had been engaged in the final settlement of the Redfern estate. "It is upon its face a perfect document," Holmes said at length, setting down his lens. "Too perfect, I think." "What do you mean, too perfect?" Vane demanded. "Is that not precisely what a forger would strive for?" "It is precisely what an inferior forger strives for, and precisely what a master forger knows to avoid," Holmes replied. "A genuine letter, written in haste or under the pressure of ordinary business, will commonly bear some small imperfection. A crossed word, an ink blot, a phrase begun and abandoned. This letter has none of these. Every line serves its purpose. Every detail confirms your guilt with a thoroughness that strikes me as almost theatrical." "Then you believe it false?" "I believe nothing yet, Mr. Vane, beyond the observation that the document was constructed with a particular end in view, and that end was not merely to suggest your misconduct, but to destroy you beyond any hope of recovery. There is a difference, and not a small one, between a forgery meant to deceive and a forgery meant to annihilate." I confess that I, for my part, was less inclined toward Vane's defence than my friend appeared to be. I had not forgotten our earlier inquiries, nor the pattern of quiet injuries that lay beneath Vane's unblemished legal record, and I said as much when our visitor had at last departed, his composure no better than when he arrived. "You think him guilty, then?" said Holmes, watching me with an expression I could not quite read. "I think him capable of a great many ungenerous acts," I admitted. "Whether he is capable of this particular fraud, I cannot say, but the document seems damning, Holmes, and I do not see how mere suspicion of its perfection can outweigh such evidence." "Perhaps it cannot," Holmes agreed, rising and crossing to the window where the autumn light had begun to fail. "And yet, Watson, consider this. The letters that preceded this discovery promised that a letter would undo Vane utterly. We now have our letter. The promise has been kept with remarkable punctuality. I find myself wondering less whether Vane is guilty of the fraud described and more whether the person who has engineered this exposure cares in the slightest whether he is guilty or not. He said no more that evening, and I did not press him, knowing from long experience that Holmes's silences were generally more productive than my questions. But I remember that I slept poorly that night, troubled by a vague sense that the affair, scandalous as it already was, had not yet shown us its darkest face. I was not mistaken. Chapter 4. The Fall of Horace Vane. We were not 3 days further into this strange business when a telegram arrived that altered its entire complexion. Holmes read it standing, his coffee forgotten upon the table, and passed it to me without a word. Come at once. Vane found dead this morning. Lestrade. I have seen Holmes receive news of violent death on more occasions than I care to number, and I had grown accustomed to a certain coolness in him at such moments, a coolness that I had long since ceased to mistake for indifference. Yet on this occasion I observed something sharper in his manner, a kind of contained urgency, as though the telegram confirmed a fear he had not troubled to share with me. "Get your hat, Watson," was all he said. We found Gray's Inn in that peculiar state of subdued commotion which attends a death among the respectable classes. Constables stationed discreetly at doors, clerks gathered in low conversation upon the stairs, the ordinary business of the chambers entirely suspended. Lestrade met us at the entrance to Vane's private study, his expression grave. "A bad business, Mr. Holmes, though I cannot say it surprises me overmuch, given what the papers have been printing this past week. The clerk found him this morning when he came to open the office. He was at his desk." Vane lay slumped forward across the great mahogany desk that I remembered from our earlier visit, his head turned to one side, his face composed in death with an expression I can only describe as one of profound weariness. A small pistol lay upon the floor near his right hand, and beside his elbow, weighted down by an ink bottle, lay a single sheet of paper in Vane's own unmistakable hand. "I cannot bear what is to come," it read. "I have deceived those who trusted me, and I will not live to see myself further exposed. God forgive me. H. Vane." "You see the case as I do, I think," Lestrade said, watching Holmes with the air of a man who expects, not for the first time, to be contradicted. The scandal broke. The man's reputation, built over 30 years, lay in ruins. He could not face what was coming, and he took the only way out that seemed open to him. It is not an uncommon story, Mr. Holmes, sad as it is. "It is not an uncommon story," Holmes agreed, "which is precisely what recommends caution in accepting it. The common explanation is not always the false one, Lestrade, but it is always the one most readily seized upon, and a careful man does well to examine it before he embraces it." He moved about the room as he spoke, touching nothing, his eyes travelling from the body to the desk, from the desk to the window, from the window to a small calendar of engagements that stood propped against the inkstand. "This calendar, Lestrade, has it been examined?" I glanced at it. What of it? Holmes lifted it carefully by its edges and turned the leaves for my benefit. I saw in Vane's own neat hand a series of appointments extending well into the following fortnight, a consultation with a client regarding a property conveyance, a meeting with his bankers, a dinner engagement noted simply as Fenwick Matter, Thursday next. "A man planning to take his own life this morning does not commonly trouble himself with engagements a fortnight hence," Holmes observed. "He may have written them before the scandal broke," Lestrade suggested, though without great conviction. "He may. Let us see whether anything else troubles that theory." Holmes crossed to the desk and drew from beneath a paperweight a letter from a firm of investment brokers, dated only 2 days previously, acknowledging receipt of a substantial sum for placement in a series of railway securities. "Here is a man, Lestrade, who 2 days ago was arranging for the future growth of his capital. I do not say it is impossible for a man in despair to attend to such business out of mere habit. I say only that the picture you offer me of a man so broken by exposure that he could not face another day sits uneasily beside a calendar of future engagements and a letter concerning investments intended to mature some years hence. Lestrade's expression had grown thoughtful, though he was not yet prepared to abandon his theory. "There is the note, Mr. Holmes. You cannot dismiss a confession in the man's own hand." "I dismiss nothing," said Holmes. "I observe only that a confession of guilt and a confession of intent to die are two different documents, and that this one, brief as it is, commits him to neither with any great precision. He says he cannot bear what is to come. He does not say what that is. He says he has deceived those who trusted him. He does not say in what manner or to what degree. I confess that even I, accustomed as I was to my friend's methods, found myself uncertain whether he pursued a genuine suspicion or merely a scruple against accepting too readily what appeared, on its surface, a tragedy unremarkable in its outline. The room offered, so far as I could see, nothing to contradict the obvious account. A man exposed, a pistol, a note, a death. And yet as we descended the stairs together, Holmes was silent in a manner I had learned to associate not with satisfaction but with disquiet. "The forgery alone would have ruined him," he said at last, as we stood once more in the courtyard. "But ruin is not death, Watson, and a man of Vane's temperament, hard and calculating as we have found him, does not strike me as one who chooses extinction over disgrace. He has weathered disgrace before in smaller measure, and weathered it without flinching." "Then who? Holmes? And why?" "That," said he, drawing his coat about him against the chill, "is the question upon which everything now depends. We have, if I am not mistaken, no longer a case of forgery alone, but one of forgery, scandal, and death entwined together, and we must look, I think, at every soul who stood to gain from any one of the three." He began, almost to himself, to number them upon his fingers. Eleanor Redfern, who sees her uncle's wrong righted and her own fortune restored. Captain Fenwick, who has waited years, perhaps, for some measure of revenge. Young Bellamy, who may yet rise in a chambers now without its master. And Mrs. Marsh, who has held the keys to every document Vane ever possessed, and who has watched him, these 20 years, with eyes I confess I have not yet learned to read. He said nothing further until we had reached Baker Street, and I for my part did not press him, sensing that the case had entered upon a darker road than either of us had anticipated, when first Horace Vane climbed our stair, anxious only for his reputation, and not yet knowing, perhaps, how soon he would forfeit his life. Chapter 5. Faces Behind Masks. Holmes did not, as I had half expected, summon the 4 persons whose names he had numbered upon his fingers to any formal inquisition. He preferred, he told me, to see them each upon their own ground, surrounded by the ordinary furniture of their lives, where a man or woman is less prepared to compose a performance for a stranger's benefit. A drawing-room interview, Watson, is a kind of theatre, and every witness knows it for one. I would rather catch a face unrehearsed. We found Eleanor Redfern first, in the modest lodging she kept in Bloomsbury, a young woman of perhaps 26, dark-haired, with a directness of gaze that I found, on the whole, rather to her credit. She received the news of Vane's death, which she had of course already read in the papers, with no pretence of grief. "I will not insult you by pretending sorrow, Mr. Holmes," she said. "Mr. Vane robbed me of what was rightfully mine, with such cleverness that I could never have proven it in any court. If the letter that has come to light is genuine, then the truth has simply caught up with him at last. And if it is not genuine—" For the first time something flickered behind her composure. Not guilt, I thought, but a kind of weary disappointment. "Then I do not know what to believe, Mr. Holmes, and I find I no longer greatly care. My uncle's estate is gone from my hands either way. His death does not return it to me." Holmes watched her closely as she spoke, and I saw him note, as I noted myself, the absence of any note of triumph in her voice. Whatever satisfaction she might have taken in Vane's exposure, she betrayed none whatever in his death. Captain Hugh Fenwick we discovered at his club, a heavy, weathered man who greeted the subject of Vane with an honesty that startled me by its very bluntness. I hated the man, Mr. Holmes, and I'll not pretend otherwise to you or to anyone. He cost my family the better part of our fortune through some legal trick I never fully understood and could never afford to contest. If you had told me a month ago that he had died of poison administered by my own hand, I might almost have thanked you for the suggestion." He paused, and something in his weathered face changed, grew suddenly uncertain. "But dead, Mr. Holmes. By his own hand, they say. I confess it has shaken me more than I should have expected. I wanted to see him ruined. I never wished to see him in his coffin." "You're surprised by his death," Holmes said, watching him. "Surprised, sir? I am thunderstruck. A man like Vane does not strike me as one to take a pistol to himself. He was too fond of winning to admit defeat in so final a fashion." Fenwick caught himself, as though aware he had spoken more freely than he intended, and said no further word upon the subject. It was Arthur Bellamy, the junior clerk, whom we found least composed of the four. We met him in the chambers themselves, where he had remained, white-faced and dutiful, attending to such business as could not be set aside even by his employer's death. At the mention of the forged letter, his hands, which had been steady enough through the earlier part of our conversation, began to tremble visibly, and he answered our questions in short, careful sentences, as a man picks his way across uncertain ice. "I know nothing of the letter's origin, Mr. Holmes. I swear it." His voice, as he said this, lacked the conviction I should have expected from an honest denial, and I confess that I marked him then, in my own mind, as the most likely author of the fraud, whatever might come of the larger question of Vane's death. Mrs. Lydia Marsh, last of the four, received us in the small office adjoining the archive room, where she had evidently continued, even in the midst of scandal and death, to maintain the meticulous order that was so plainly the governing principle of her life. She was a woman of perhaps 50, grey-haired, composed, her hands folded before her with a stillness that seemed to me even then faintly unnatural. "I have served Mr. Vane for above 20 years, she said, in answer to Holmes's first question. "Whatever his faults, and I will not pretend he had none, he was never less than fair to me. I find his death a great grief, Mr. Holmes, whatever the newspapers may choose to print about him." "You defend his memory with some warmth," Holmes observed. "I defend it because I knew the man, sir, and the gentlemen who write for the newspapers did not." There was, in her tone, a protectiveness that struck me as curious in an employee toward an employer so generally disliked, and Holmes, I noticed, allowed his eyes to rest upon her a long moment before he spoke again. We left Gray's Inn as the early dusk was settling, and walked some way in silence before Holmes spoke. "Well, Watson, you have your candidate, I think." "Bellamy," said I without hesitation. His hands shook, Holmes. His voice failed him. He could scarcely meet your eye when the letter was mentioned. If that is not the manner of a guilty man, I have never observed one. "It is certainly the manner of a frightened one," Holmes replied, "though I would caution you, my dear fellow, against too readily equating the two. Fear takes many forms, and points to many different rooms in a man's conscience. A man may tremble because he has forged a letter, or because he has stolen a shilling, or because he loves a woman he dare not name, or because he conceals some small failure that shames him though it harms no one. The guilty conscience and the frightened one wear the same face, Watson, and it takes more than a tremor of the hand to tell them apart. Then what would you have us conclude from today?" "Only this," said Holmes, as we turned at last into Baker Street, "that every one of the four has shown us a face, and behind every face, I think, lies something he or she has not yet told us. Whether any of those hidden things is murder remains, for the present, entirely unproven. Chapter 6. The Weight of Loyalty. It is a peculiarity of Holmes's method, one which I had observed many times before yet never ceased to admire, that he would frequently set aside the most dramatic thread of an inquiry in favour of the most tedious, on the principle that truth concealed itself most often in the places men troubled least to look. So it was that for the better part of 2 days following our interviews at Gray's Inn, my friend occupied himself not with theories of murder, but with the dry chronology of Horace Vane's final weeks of life. He obtained, through means I didn't inquire too closely into, copies of the firm's appointment books, its correspondence registers, and such financial records as the temporary administrator of the practice was willing to release. These he spread across our sitting-room floor in a manner that drove poor Mrs. Hudson very nearly to distraction, and through which he moved on his hands and knees for the better part of an evening, murmuring to himself in a fashion I had learned long ago not to interrupt. "There is a pattern here, Watson, though I confess it is not yet the pattern I expected to find." "What have you discovered?" "That young Bellamy is not entirely the innocent figure he appears, though I begin to doubt very much that his sin is the one you have assigned him." Holmes tapped a column of figures with his pencil. "Some 18 months ago, a small disbursement was made from a client's trust account, recorded here as a fee for professional services rendered. I have compared the figure against the corresponding entry in the client's own ledger, obtained, I need hardly say, through entirely proper channels, and the two do not agree. A sum of some £40 has been quietly absorbed, the discrepancy concealed by an alteration so neatly executed that only a man already suspicious would trouble to look for it. Bellamy's hand? Unmistakably. It was the following morning that Holmes summoned the young clerk to a private interview, conducted not at the chambers, where the air of authority might have closed his lips entirely, but in a quiet corner of a public house near Gray's Inn, where Holmes's manner, gentler than I had seen it in some days, seemed at last to loosen the young man's tongue. "You discovered it then," Bellamy said, when Holmes laid the figures before him without preamble. His face, which had been pale throughout our previous meeting, went paler still, but I noticed that his hands, this time, were steady. "I have waited 18 months for someone to discover it, Mr. Holmes, and I confess there is almost relief in having the waiting over. Tell me the whole of it." The young man's account, given haltingly at first and then with increasing candour, was this. A client of the firm, an elderly widow of small means, had come to Vane some 2 years previously in considerable distress, having discovered upon her husband's death a quantity of debts contracted secretly during his lifetime, debts that threatened to consume the modest annuity upon which she depended. Bellamy, moved by what he described as simple pity, had quietly diverted a small sum from another far wealthier client's trust account, one whose fortune could absorb the loss without injury, in order to satisfy the widow's most pressing creditor and spare her the shame of public insolvency. It was wrong, Mr. Holmes. I have never pretended otherwise to myself, whatever comfort I took in the kindness of the act. Mr. Vane discovered the alteration within a fortnight, for very little escaped him in matters of account. And he did not dismiss you. He summoned me to his office and told me in the coldest voice I have ever heard a man use that he understood precisely what I had done and why. He said that sentiment was a luxury a solicitor could not afford, and that I had jeopardized the firm's good name for the sake of a woman who was, in the end, no concern of his. I expected dismissal, prosecution perhaps. Instead, he told me he would correct the entry himself, quietly, from his own pocket, and that the matter would never be spoken of again, provided I served him with absolute loyalty from that day forward. And you have. I have, Mr. Holmes, though it has sat upon my conscience like a stone these 18 months. When the forged letter appeared, and the talk began of Mr. Vane's dishonesty, I confess my first thought was terror that my own old transgression would be dragged into the light alongside it. That was the fear you saw in my face, sir, and no other. Holmes regarded him a long moment, and I thought I saw something almost like sympathy cross his features. You owe your career, then, to his silence. I owe him a great deal more than my career, Mr. Holmes. I owe him whatever honour I have left. We returned to Gray's Inn that same afternoon, where a second conversation, briefer but no less significant, awaited us with Mrs. Marsh. Holmes had asked her, with characteristic indirection, whether anything in Vane's final weeks had struck her as unusual, and after some hesitation she answered, "He had become anxious, Mr. Holmes, these past 2 months about the old archive room, He asked me more than once whether any of the historical correspondence had been disturbed, whether the inventory was complete, whether I had observed any person lingering there beyond what business required. I thought it merely the fretfulness of a man growing older. I see now, perhaps, that I was wrong to think so lightly of it. Someone had been searching among the old papers, Holmes said, half to himself. I believe so, Mr. Holmes, though I could not say who, nor what they sought. As we walked home that evening, Holmes was unusually quiet, and when at last he spoke, it was with a gravity I had not heard in him since the case began. We have uncovered, Watson, not one secret but several, and not a single one of them, so far as I can determine, is murder. Bellamy conceals an old kindness turned to old shame. Mrs. Marsh conceals, I think, a grief she does not yet wish to examine too closely. Each of our 4 suspects indeed conceals something, and each concealment has masqueraded in our eyes as evidence of guilt. Then we're no nearer the truth than before. On the contrary, said Holmes, we're a great deal nearer, though the truth we approach is not the one we expected. The guilty man, Watson, is concealed not by lies, but by the truth others are afraid to tell. We have been listening these past days to confessions of shame and confessions of kindness. We have not yet heard the confession that matters, and I begin to suspect it lies closer to that archive room than any of us has yet supposed. Chapter 7. The Accepted Solution. I had scarcely finished my breakfast 3 mornings later when Lestrade arrived at Baker Street in a state of evident satisfaction, a state so rare in our dealings with that worthy inspector that I confess it gave me for a moment more pleasure than suspicion. "You may put your magnifying glass away, Mr. Holmes," said he, settling himself into the basket chair with the air of a man who has earned his rest. "The matter is concluded. Bellamy confessed the whole of it last evening, and a more complete confession I have never taken down in 20 years of service." Holmes, who had been occupied at the chemical bench in the corner, set down his retort with deliberate care and turned to face our visitor, his expression giving away nothing of what he felt. "Pray let us have it from the beginning, Lestrade. It is simple enough, now that the boy has spoken. He admits to forging the letter that appeared among the Redfern papers, the very document that drove Vane to his death. He says he had grown to hate his employer over a long period, though he would not at first say why, only that Vane had held some manner of power over him these 18 months past, and that the resentment of it had festered until he could bear it no longer. I confess that my own thoughts flew at once to the confession Bellamy had made to us, not 3 days before, of the embezzled trust money and Vane's cold conditional mercy, and I saw at once how naturally one explanation grew from the other. A man bound to silence by gratitude may yet come, in time, to resent the very debt that binds him, and resentment nursed in secret for 18 months might easily ripen into an act of vengeance dressed as righteousness. He says, Lestrade continued, consulting his notebook, that he took advantage of his knowledge of the old archive room, where he had occasion to file documents from time to time, and there constructed the letter using genuine stationery taken from Vane's own stores, copying his employer's hand from long familiarity with it. He released it anonymously among the Redfern papers, timing its discovery for maximum effect. He swears, and I am inclined to believe him, that he intended nothing beyond public disgrace. He never imagined Vane would take his own life over it. And the anonymous warnings that preceded the letter's discovery. His as well, Mr. Holmes, written some weeks earlier to prepare the ground, as he put it, so that the eventual letter would seem the fulfilment of a long-threatened reckoning rather than a sudden accusation. He is a clever young man, whatever else may be said of him, and the scheme, once explained, hangs together with a completeness that I think even you must allow. I will own that, hearing the account laid out in this fashion, I found myself very nearly persuaded. It explained the formality of the early warnings, which had always seemed to me the work of someone who understood both law and the patient cultivation of fear. It explained Bellamy's evident nervousness when first we questioned him, which I had once read as guilt of the forgery itself, and which now seemed, in the light of Lestrade's account, to have been exactly that, however much the boy's later confession to us of the trust money had momentarily persuaded me otherwise. It explained indeed almost everything that had troubled us since Vane first climbed our stair some weeks before. "It is a tidy solution," I said, when Lestrade had taken his leave, well pleased with himself to carry the news to his superiors. "It is a very tidy solution," Holmes agreed, though something in his voice gave me pause. "Tidiness, Watson, is a quality I have learned to view with some suspicion in matters of this kind. Life is rarely so accommodating as to arrange its facts in so neat a parcel." "You do not believe him, then?" "I believe that Bellamy has confessed to something, and that his confession satisfies Lestrade, satisfies the newspapers, and will doubtless satisfy a jury, should the matter ever come before one. Whether it satisfies the facts as I myself have observed them is a different question entirely, and one I have not yet finished asking." The newspapers, when they appeared that afternoon, were unanimous in their relief. "Forger confesses" ran one headline, "Rough justice for a wronged clerk" ran another, with a sympathy for Bellamy's supposed grievance that struck me as remarkably swift to forgive what remained after all a serious crime. The public, weary of scandal and eager for resolution, embraced the explanation with the relief of a household that has found its missing silver, and need trouble itself no further with locks and bolts. I confess that I too was prepared to let the matter rest. The chain of reasoning Lestrade had presented was coherent, the motive plausible, the confession detailed and seemingly voluntary. I said as much to Holmes that evening, as we sat before the fire, and he heard me out with the patient, faintly melancholy attention he reserved for occasions when he believed me mistaken, but was not yet prepared to say precisely how. "You're very likely right, Watson, in everything except the conclusion," he said at last. "Bellamy has told the truth, I think, about a great many things. I do not believe he has told the whole of it, and there remains one piece of the puzzle, small enough that Lestrade has overlooked it entirely, which I find I cannot set aside." "What piece is that?" "The letter itself," said Holmes, rising and crossing to the cabinet where, I knew, the photographic copy still lay among his papers. "Everyone has been so occupied with what the letter said, and now with who is said to have written it, that no one has troubled to ask a far simpler question. What manner of paper was it written upon, and how old was that paper when the pen first touched it?" He said no more that night, and I, weary with the day's revelations, did not press him further. But I remember that he sat long after I'd retired, the lamp burning low, the photograph held close beneath his lens, and I confess that some part of me, drowsy as I was, felt the first faint stirring of unease, as though the tidy parcel Lestrade had laid before us might yet prove, upon closer inspection, to have been wrapped around something other than what its label promised. Chapter 8. The Overlooked Detail. It required no small exercise of Holmes's diplomacy, joined to a degree of official goodwill that Lestrade extended, I think, more out of confidence in the case's settled outcome than any expectation that fresh examination would disturb it, before we were permitted to handle the original letter itself, rather than the photographic copy upon which Holmes had thus far been obliged to work. It came to us under seal, in a plain deed box, and Holmes received it with the quiet reverence I had seen him bestow upon evidence of far greater apparent drama. "A photograph, Watson, preserves the shape of a thing," he said, drawing his chair close beneath the window where the morning light fell strongest. "But it cannot preserve its substance. Ink has a history written in its very chemistry, and paper ages as surely as a man's skin, though far more honestly, for paper does not trouble itself to conceal the truth." He began with the paper itself, holding successive corners to the light, testing its texture between thumb and finger, and at length producing from his cabinet a small array of reagents with which I had seen him work before, in matters concerning questioned documents. "The paper is old, Watson, genuinely old, mark you, not merely aged by some clumsy artifice of tea staining or careful exposure to a stove, tricks I have encountered often enough among inferior forgers. The fibres have the brittleness, the faint yellowing at the decal edge, that come only with the slow passage of years. This sheet, I should say, was manufactured a full decade or more before the letter's purported date. That accords well enough with Bellamy's account, I observed. He told Lestrade he took genuine stationery from Vane's own stores. It accords with half of his account, Holmes replied, and it is the other half that troubles me. He bent low over the document, his lens almost touching the surface of the paper, and was silent for a long moment. "Examine the ink with me, Watson, if you will lend me your eyes a moment, though I fear they are not so practised as my own in this particular art." I did as he asked, and though I confess the distinctions he pointed out to me were subtle, they were not once shown beyond my own observation. The greater part of the letter's text showed an even faded brown, the characteristic colour of iron gall ink some years removed from the pen. Yet certain phrases scattered through the body of the document, phrases that I now saw constituted the entire substance of the accusation against Vane, the words concerning the codicil, the explicit admission of its concealment, showed a colour subtly darker, the ink sitting, if I may so describe it, with a faint sharpness against the page that the surrounding text entirely lacked. "You see it, Watson?" "I see a difference, certainly, though I should never have remarked it unprompted. It is there none the less, and once seen it cannot be unseen. Observe further how these darker phrases crowd the margins of the existing lines, how a word here is compressed, a phrase there extends with peculiar economy into a space scarcely sufficient to contain it. This is not a letter written whole, Watson. This is a letter altered, the original substance of the document, some genuine and innocent correspondence of years past, preserved almost entire, with new and damning phrases inserted into the gaps an old hand had left between its lines. I confess that the implication, once grasped, struck me with considerable force. Then Bellamy did not write the letter at all. Bellamy, I think, wrote a great deal that we have attributed to this single document, the warnings perhaps some lesser portion of the supporting evidence that Lestrade has not yet troubled to examine with sufficient care. But this letter, the letter that destroyed Vane and very possibly killed him, is not his work. No clerk of 22 years, however clever, possesses the patience or the materials to age ink in this particular fashion, blending old composition with new in so delicate a graft. This is the work of someone who has spent a lifetime among old documents, who understands their chemistry as another man understands his own trade. There remained one further observation, which Holmes made only after he had set the letter aside and turned his attention to a small quantity of dust that had gathered, scarcely visible to my eye, along the document's folded edge. A residue, Watson, and an uncommon one. He transferred a portion to a slide and held it beneath his microscope, summoning me to look in turn. Wax, certainly, but blended with an oil I do not immediately recognise, something employed, I should guess, in the treatment of fine old wood. We shall test it properly before we commit ourselves, but I have encountered its like only once before in the chambers of an antiquarian bookseller who prided himself upon the care of his cabinets. It was the work of a single further visit to Gray's Inn, conducted that same afternoon under pretence of some trifling inquiry, to confirm what Holmes had by then already half divined. The desk and shelving of Vane's principal office bore no such residue. The lodgings occupied by Arthur Bellamy, modest rooms above a chandler's shop, contained nothing remotely resembling fine furniture of any antiquity. But in the private archive room where the glass-fronted case of historical correspondence stood beneath Mrs. Marsh's careful stewardship, Holmes discovered, upon a cabinet of considerable age, the very polish whose residue he had identified beneath his lens, applied, the charwoman informed us upon discreet inquiry, not many weeks before. "The case is not closed, Watson," Holmes said as we walked once more toward Baker Street through the gathering dusk, his voice grave with a satisfaction that held, I thought, very little of triumph in it. "It has scarcely yet been opened. Bellamy's confession, sincere as I believe it to have been in its particulars, accounts for the warnings, perhaps for some lesser embellishment of the case against Vane. It does not account for the letter itself, the one document upon which the entire scandal, and very possibly the death that followed it, ultimately rests. That letter was not forged in the ordinary sense at all. It was altered by a hand intimately familiar with old paper, old ink, and an old, carefully tended room, and I think, Watson, that we both know now to whom that room belongs. Chapter 9. Holmes reveals the truth. Holmes arranged, through Lestrade's somewhat reluctant cooperation, that the principal figures in the affair should gather once more in the chambers at Gray's Inn, in the very room where Vane had died, a choice which I confess struck me at the time as needlessly theatrical, though I came to understand before the hour was out why my friend had judged it necessary. Eleanor Redfern sat near the window, composed but watchful. Captain Fenwick stood rather than sat, as though unwilling to commit himself fully to the proceedings. Bellamy occupied a chair near the door, his face white but steady, and Mrs. Marsh sat in her accustomed place beside the desk, her hands folded as I had seen them folded on every occasion of our meeting, with that same unnatural stillness which I had once mistaken for mere composure. "I have asked you here," Holmes began, "because the explanation accepted by the public and very nearly accepted by myself does not satisfy the evidence. I propose to tell you what I believe actually occurred, and I shall ask you, Mrs. Marsh, to correct me where I am wrong." She did not flinch, though I saw her hands tighten slightly upon one another. "Some years ago," Holmes continued, "Mr. Vane administered a portion of the Redfern estate in a manner that was, I believe, unethical without being criminal. A minor document, a memorandum perhaps, touching upon provisions that would have benefited Miss Redfern, was quietly set aside and never acted upon. It was the sort of small, deniable injury in which Mr. Vane, by every account we have gathered, specialised throughout his career." Eleanor's face had gone very pale, but she said nothing, and Holmes did not pause for her. This document, or some record of it, lay buried among the old archive papers for years, undisturbed, until someone, in the ordinary course of cataloguing and preservation, came upon it. That someone, I believe, was you, Mrs. Marsh, and I believe further that the discovery was, for you, a catastrophe far greater than its modest legal substance might suggest. For you had served Mr. Vane faithfully for above 20 years, and had believed him, whatever his reputation among strangers, to be a man of fundamental honour. "I believed it because I wished to believe it," Mrs. Marsh said quietly, the first words she'd spoken since our arrival, "and because he had never given me cause in 2 decades to think otherwise of him." "The discovery shattered that belief," Holmes said gently now. "You did not wish to see him prosecuted, I think, for the injury was old, and the law would have struggled to touch it after so long a passage of years. You wished instead that the world should know him as you now knew him. You possessed both the materials and the skill, through long familiarity with old correspondence, to alter a genuine letter from your archive into an instrument that would proclaim his guilt with a force the law itself could never have achieved. You aged your insertions as best you could, blended new phrases with old ink, and trusted that the document's evident antiquity would silence any doubt as to its authenticity. "I wished only for the truth to be known," she said, and her voice, though still quiet, carried now a depth of feeling she had concealed through every previous meeting. "I didn't wish him dead, Mr. Holmes. I wished him shamed, as he had shamed others, quietly, for 30 years, without ever once standing before a judgment that could touch him." "I believe you," Holmes said, "and I believe further that young Bellamy, learning fragments of what you had discovered, though not the whole of it, contributed his own forgeries in the honest conviction that he was helping to expose a corruption he himself had cause to resent. 2 separate deceptions, gentlemen, conceived independently and for different reasons, became entangled in the public eye as a single conspiracy, and neither author fully understood the other's hand in it." Bellamy at this looked across at Mrs. Marsh with an expression of such genuine astonishment that I knew at once Holmes had spoken truly. The young clerk had not known. But this, Holmes continued, his voice growing graver, explains only the scandal. It does not explain the death, and it is here, Mrs. Marsh, that I must ask you to tell us yourself what occurred, for I can reconstruct the broad outline, but only you can supply the particulars. For a long moment she said nothing, and I thought she might refuse him entirely. Then, with the composure of a woman who has rehearsed a confession many times in solitude, she spoke. He came to the archive room 3 nights before his death, Mr. Holmes, having grown suspicious, I think, of my anxiety these past weeks. He found me with the letter in my hands before ever it reached the Redfern papers, and he understood at once what I intended. He demanded I surrender it. I refused. There was a struggle, Mr. Holmes, brief and ugly. Neither of us, I think, fully in command of ourselves. He seized my wrist, I pulled away, and in pulling away I struck him more by accident than design, so that he staggered back against the hearth. I heard the sound his head made against the marble, and I knew, before ever I crossed the room to him, that he was beyond my help. Her voice did not break, though I saw the effort it cost her to keep it steady. I did not mean to kill him, Mr. Holmes. I have asked myself 100 times since whether I might have called for aid, fetched a physician, faced what I had done honestly. I did not. I was afraid, and fear is a poor counsellor. I arranged the room as you found it, took up his own pen to write the note in a hand close enough to his own to pass unquestioned, and left him to be discovered as a man broken by scandal rather than a man who had died in a moment's violence he had himself provoked. The room was very silent when she had finished. Eleanor wept quietly into her handkerchief. Fenwick stood rigid, his face unreadable. Lestrade, who had said nothing throughout the whole recitation, stepped forward at last to do his duty. "I do not excuse what you have done," Holmes said to her as Lestrade's men came forward, "and the law, I think, will not excuse it either, whatever sympathy your history may earn you. But I will say this. You were driven to it not by greed, nor by malice for its own sake, but by a faith betrayed, and a sense of justice that found no honest channel through which to flow. That is no defence in law, Mrs. Marsh, but it is, I think, the truth, and the truth, however painful, is owed to you as much as to anyone in this room." Chapter 10. Watson's Reflection. Miss Marsh surrendered herself with the same composure that had marked her through every meeting I had had with her, offering no resistance, and so far as I'm aware, no further word of self-defence beyond what she had already given us in that quiet room at Gray's Inn. The trial, when it came some weeks later, was a sombre affair, conducted with none of the sensational appetite the newspapers had earlier shown for the scandal itself. The judge, weighing the absence of premeditation against the undeniable fact of concealment and false witness, dealt with her, I am told, as leniently as the law allowed, though leniency in such matters is a relative and a cold comfort. Bellamy fared rather better than I had once supposed he might. His confession, though it had proven incomplete in the particular that mattered most, had been honest as far as it went, and the court took some account of the 18 months of quiet servitude that had preceded his lapse, and of the genuine, if misguided, conviction that had driven him to it. He was convicted upon a lesser charge, and I am glad to record that I encountered his name, some 2 years afterward, attached to a respectable firm in Leeds, where I trust the lesson of those troubled months has served him better than the punishment alone could have done. Eleanor Redfern's affairs concluded more happily than any other strand of this unhappy business. The civil proceedings that followed the exposure of Vane's old misconduct, conducted now without the taint of forgery to confuse the issue, restored to her the greater part of the inheritance that had been quietly diverted from her years before. I had occasion to see her once more some months after the trial, and found her, if not entirely free of the bitterness the affair had left in her, at least possessed once more of the modest independence that was, after all, her rightful due. It was a grey afternoon in December, with the first true fog of the winter settling over Baker Street, that Holmes and I sat together reviewing, as was sometimes our habit, the conclusion of an affair some weeks closed. He had taken up his violin, though he played that day in a meditative rather than a demonstrative fashion, drawing out long, low passages that seemed to ask questions rather than answer them. "It is a melancholy case, Watson, when one comes to consider it whole," he said, setting the instrument down at last. "We have in the end no villain in the ordinary sense, and no innocent party either. Vane was not the monster the newspapers painted him in his final week, nor was he the blameless victim his earlier reputation might have suggested. He practised a cruelty so patient and so legally correct that no court could ever have touched it, and that cruelty in the end produced its own reckoning, though by a hand and through a method no court could condone. And Mrs. Marsh? Neither monster nor innocent, as you yourself might put it, a woman who served faithfully for 20 years, who discovered at last that her faith had been misplaced, and who sought a justice the law could not provide, only to find herself, in a moment of fear and violence neither planned nor wished for, guilty of an offence far graver than the one she set out to expose. I confess, Watson, that I have rarely closed a case with so little satisfaction in the outcome, however complete my satisfaction in the reasoning that led to it. I had grown accustomed, over the years of our association, to a certain dispassion in Holmes when a case concluded, a scientific pleasure in the chain of logic that had led him to the truth, undisturbed, for the most part, by the human wreckage the truth so often left behind. It struck me, therefore, as something rather different in him, that grey December afternoon, to hear him speak with so plain a note of regret. "The law addresses actions, Watson," he said, after a silence in which I heard only the soft crackle of the fire and the muffled traffic beyond our window. "It asks what a person did, and it punishes accordingly, with what justice it can muster. Conscience asks a harder question. It asks why, and it is far slower to forgive itself an easy answer. I think a society requires both, the law's blunt instrument and conscience's finer one, for justice without mercy soon becomes cruelty in its own right, and mercy without justice becomes mere sentiment, comfortable to the merciful and meaningless to the wronged. But neither justice nor mercy can function at all, Watson, unless the truth beneath them is first established, however unwelcome that truth may prove to be. That, I think, has always been the whole of my trade. Not punishment, not pardon, only the truth, offered honestly to those who must then decide what to do with it." I made no immediate reply, for I had learned long since that Holmes's reflections, offered in such moods, asked for no answer beyond the silence of attention. I thought instead of Horace Vane, dead at his own desk through a violence he had himself provoked, and of Lydia Marsh, whose 20 years of quiet loyalty had ended in a single moment's panic from which there could be no honest retreat. I thought of Bellamy's misguided kindness, and of Eleanor Redfern's long patience finally rewarded, and of Captain Fenwick, whose hatred, however justified in its origin, had found no part to play in the violence that ultimately answered it. It is for this reason, I think, that I have set this account among those papers I've marked, in my own private notation, as unsuited to publication during the lifetime of the parties concerned, for there is in it no triumphant villain to be unmasked, no innocence to be wholly restored, only a slow accumulation of small wrongs and smaller mercies, each compounding the other until a death resulted that none, in the beginning, had truly intended. And yet I record it here, as I have recorded so many of Holmes's investigations, because it remains, whatever its sorrows, a testament to that peculiar discipline of his, the patient triumph of reason over confusion, of careful observation over the comfortable lies that appearances so often tell. The fog thickened beyond our window as the afternoon wore on, and Holmes, his reflections spent, returned once more to his violin, drawing from it now a gentler air, while I sat by the fire and gave myself over to the quiet satisfaction, troubled though it was, of having seen once again the truth brought finally and fully into the light.